They said a boy born in chains could never understand the language of iron and gears. They said people like him were meant for picking cotton, not for building machines. They were so convinced of this that when James stood before them, grease on his hands and a working contraption made from plantation trash, the white engineers laughed right in his face. They called him a liar, a thief. They claimed he must have stolen their designs, the very designs that had failed for 3 weeks straight. But when that machine roared to life and processed more cotton in 10 minutes than their best workers could in an hour, the laughter stopped. And in that silence, something shifted. Because the boy they called property had just proven he understood something they never could. This is the story of how one enslaved child, armed with nothing but scraps and genius, brought a southern plantation to its knees, and made grown men with engineering degrees question everything they thought they knew about who deserves to be free. Before we continue with this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're listening from. Let's strengthen our community together. Thank you. Now, back to the story. Whitfield Plantation sat in the Fertile Crescent of central Alabama, about 40 miles south of Montgomery. The property stretched across nearly 2,000 acres of rich, dark soil that had been growing cotton since 1798. 3 generations of Whitfields had worked this land, and 3 generations of enslaved families had bled into it. By 1865, the plantation was home to 147 enslaved people, a big house with white columns visible from the main road, and a reputation for producing some of the finest long-staple cotton in the state. The land rolled gently, with the main fields occupying the flattest sections near Kai Creek. The creek ran year-round, providing water for irrigation and power for the old mill that ground corn and wheat. Oak trees lined the drive up to the big house, their branches forming a canopy that kept the family cool in summer. But behind the fields, past the cotton gin and the storage barns, that was where the quarters stood. 23 cabins made of rough-cut pine, ranged in 2 rows facing each other. No trees for shade, no canopy to cool the air, just bare ground packed hard by decades of feet walking the same paths to the same forced labor. In the 3rd cabin from the north end, that was where Rosie lived with her son James. The cabin measured 12 feet by 14 feet. 1 room for everything, sleeping, cooking, living, dying. The walls were bare pine boards with gaps wide enough to see through. When it rained, water came in through the roof and turned the dirt floor to mud. When winter came, the cold crept through every crack and settled into your bones. There was a fireplace made of clay and sticks that smoked so badly your eyes watered. But it was the only source of heat and the only place to cook the meager rations they received each week. The roof was patched with pieces of tin and tar paper that Rosie had scavenged over the years, but it still leaked in a dozen places. During heavy storms, they had to move their sleeping pallets around to avoid the worst of the water. The floor was dirt packed hard from years of feet, and in summer it turned to dust that got into everything, your food, your lungs, your hair. Those rations were calculated down to the ounce. Each adult received 3.5 pounds of salt pork or bacon per week, along with a peck of cornmeal. That was it. No vegetables unless you could grow them in the small plots behind the cabins. No fruit unless you could steal it. No milk, no butter, no sugar. Children received half rations until they were old enough to work full days in the fields. Rosie had learned to stretch those portions in ways that defied mathematics. She made corn cakes that were more water than meal. She She boiled the salt pork until the bones were soft enough to eat. She foraged for wild greens in the woods when the overseer wasn't watching. She caught crawfish in the creek with her bare hands. She knew which tree bark could be ground into flour when the cornmeal ran out. And still there were nights when James went to sleep with his stomach cramping from hunger. Nights when he dreamed of food and woke up to nothing but the same empty bowl that had been empty the night before. The value of an enslaved person at Whitfield Plantation was written in Master Whitfield's ledger, kept locked in his study. A prime field hand male aged 20 to 35 was worth between $1,200 and $1,500. A woman of childbearing age was worth slightly less, maybe $1,000. But her value increased with each child she produced, because each child was future property. Children under 10 had little monetary value, since they could not yet work full days. They were investments, costs to be managed until they could earn their keep. James, at his birth in 1857, was assigned a value of $50, the same as a young mule. Rosie remembered the day the appraiser came through the quarters, writing numbers in his book next to each person's name. He had looked at baby James, checked his limbs for deformities, listened to his breathing, then scratched $50 in his ledger without another thought. That was what her son's life was worth to these people. $50, less than the cost of the suit Master Whitfield wore to church. But Rosie knew her son was worth more than any number in any ledger. She saw it in the way he watched everything. While other children played, James studied. He studied the way the wagon wheels turned. He studied the hinges on the barn doors. He studied the pulley system that lifted water from the well. His eyes were always moving, always learning, always trying to understand how things worked. And that terrified her, because curiosity in a slave child was dangerous. Questions led to beatings. Thinking led to suspicion. Intelligence was a threat to the order of things. She had seen it before. Smart children who asked too many questions, who showed too much potential, they disappeared. Sold south to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. Or they got broken, beaten so badly and so often that the light went out of their eyes, and they became hollow shells just going through the motions of living. Rosie herself had learned this lesson at age 12, when she asked the overseer why the enslaved people could not read if reading was so important. The overseer, a man named Cyrus Pettigrew, had beaten her with a leather strap until her back was crosshatched with welts that took weeks to heal. Then he made her stand in the hot sun for 6 hours without water as an example to the others. Knowledge is for white folks, he told her while the strap fell again and again. Your kind needs strong backs, not smart mouths. From that day forward, Rosie learned to hide her thoughts behind a mask of compliance. Yes, sir. No, sir. Whatever you say, sir. Thank you, sir. She learned to make herself small, invisible, unthreatening. It was the only way to survive. But inside, behind the mask, her mind never stopped working. She remembered everything, every injustice, every cruelty, every moment of degradation. And she promised herself that if she ever had children, she would teach them how to survive in a world that wanted them dead. She tried to teach James the same lesson, but the boy could not help himself. When he was 5 years old, he asked the blacksmith why heating metal made it easier to bend. The blacksmith, An enslaved man named Marcus, who had been working iron for 30 years, looked around nervously before answering. Heat makes the metal softer, boy. Makes the molecules move around more so they can slide past each other. Now stop asking questions before you get us both whipped. But James could not stop. His mind worked like one of the machines he studied, always turning, always processing. Why did the water wheel turn? Why did some woods burn hotter than others? Why did metal rust? Why did the cotton gin have teeth arranged in that particular pattern? Why did the plow blade curve that way? Why did the wagon need grease on the axles? Every day brought new questions, and Rosie lived in constant fear that one of those questions would be overheard by the wrong person. Every day began the same way. The bell rang at 4:30 in the morning, a harsh clang that cut through the darkness and pulled people from whatever small bit of rest they had managed to find. The bell was mounted on a post in the center of the quarters, and Pettigrew rang it with obvious pleasure, swinging the rope hard enough to make the bell scream. There was no snooze button, no 5 more minutes, no mercy for the sick or the exhausted. You got up or you got the whip. Rosie would rise first, her body aching from the previous day's work, and light a small fire to heat water for corn mush. Lighting the fire itself was a skill. The wood was often damp, the kindling scarce. She had learned to save the driest pieces, to blow on the embers just right, to coax flame from almost nothing. James would wake to the sound of her moving in the dark, the smell of smoke, the low murmur of voices from other cabins as the quarters came reluctantly to life. He would watch her work, seeing how she did everything with economy of movement, nothing wasted, every action purposeful. By 5 o'clock, everyone was expected to be in the fields. Men, women, children over the age of 8. The only exceptions were the house servants who worked in the big house, the blacksmith, the carpenter, and the very old or very sick who could no longer work. Everyone else went to the cotton. During planting season, you worked the soil with hoes and plows, breaking up the hard red clay until your hands bled. During growing season, you chopped weeds and thin plants under the burning Alabama sun. During picking season, you filled sacks until your fingers bled and your back screamed, and you prayed for death just to make it stop. The workday lasted until dark, sometimes longer during harvest when the moon was bright enough to see by. 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours during peak season. Time meant nothing except pain. The only way you knew what day it was came from the rhythm of work. Cotton picking meant fall. Plowing meant spring. The years blurred together into one long nightmare of labor. James was too young for fieldwork until he turned 8. So he spent his early years in the care of old Ruth, a woman in her 70s who watched the small children while their parents worked. Ruth had been born on Whitfield Plantation, had lived her entire life within these boundaries, had buried 2 husbands and 5 children. 3 of her children had been sold away when Master Whitfield's father needed money to pay gambling debts. She never saw them again, never knew if they lived or died. That kind of grief does something to a person, hollows them out, or makes them harder than iron. Ruth was the hard kind. She taught the young ones how to survive. Keep your eyes down around white folks. Never talk back. Not even when they are wrong. Not even when they are lying. Never run unless you want the dogs on you, and those dogs will tear you apart before you make it a mile. Never fight back even when they hit you first, because they will kill you and say you were being uppity. These were the lessons that mattered. Reading and writing were forbidden by law. But Ruth taught them other things. How to identify which plants were safe to eat. How to set a snare for rabbits. How to move through the woods without making noise. How to read the night sky for direction in case you ever got the chance to run north. Survival skills for people who were never supposed to survive. But James learned something else during those years with old Ruth. He learned that the white folks threw away treasures. Behind the big house, there was a trash pile where the Whitfield family discarded broken tools, worn-out equipment, anything that no longer served them perfectly. A hinge with a loose pin, a saw with a bent blade, a hammer with a cracked handle, a bucket with a small hole in the bottom. To them, it was garbage. The cost of replacing these items was nothing compared to the bother of fixing them. To James, it was possibility. He started collecting things when he was 6 years old. A bent nail here, a broken hinge there, a length of chain with a snapped link, a piece of leather strap from an old harness, a cracked wooden handle, a gear from some machine he could not identify. He carried these items back to the cabin and hid them under the floorboards, which were loose enough to pry up with your fingers. The space underneath was damp and smelled of earth, but it kept his treasures hidden. Rosie saw what he was doing, and her heart filled with dread. "Baby, you got to stop this," she told him one night, her voice urgent and scared. "They catch you taking things from the big house, they will beat you. They will beat me. They will say you are stealing and they will make an example. Please, baby, just leave it alone." But James could not explain to her what he felt when he held those broken pieces in his hands. It was like they spoke to him in a language nobody had taught him, a language older than words. He could see how they fit together. He could imagine how they might work. He could feel the potential humming inside the metal. At night, by the weak light of a tallow candle that Rosie made from rendered pig fat, he would take out his collection and arrange the pieces in different combinations. A nail through a hole in the metal, a chain looped through the hinge, a gear meshing with another gear. His small fingers worked with a precision that seemed impossible for a child his age, testing connections, imagining movement, understanding instinctively how force and motion work together. The other enslaved people in the quarters noticed. Some thought the boy was touched in the head, that he had some kind of mental affliction that made him obsess over trash. Others thought he had a gift. Maybe something spiritual. Maybe something from Africa that had survived the Middle Passage and the generations of slavery. Marcus the blacksmith was the first to see real potential. He watched James one evening, saw the way the boy's hands moved with purpose, saw the concentration in his young face, saw how he was not just playing but working, solving problems, learning. "That boy got something special," Marcus told Rosie one Sunday when they had a few hours of rest. "You need to protect that." But how do you protect a gift in a place designed to crush anything that makes you different? How do you keep a light burning when everything around you is designed to snuff it out? When James turned 8 in 1865, everything changed. The war had been raging for 4 years. Everyone knew it, even though the white folks tried to keep news from reaching the quarters. But information has a way of traveling. Travelers on the road would whisper to field workers. House servants would overhear conversations and pass them along. Newspapers left lying around would be examined by those few who had secretly learned to read. You could feel the war in the tension that hung over the plantation like humidity. Master Whitfield was anxious, short-tempered, prone to fits of rage over small mistakes. His oldest son had died at Gettysburg, shot through the chest in Pickett's charge, that suicidal assault that accomplished nothing except filling graveyards. His younger son had come home with one arm missing below the elbow and a laudanum habit that grew worse every month. The boy sat on the porch of the big house all day, staring at nothing, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing at things that were not funny. The overseer carried his pistol everywhere now, even when he walked between the cabins at night, checking to make sure no one was meeting or planning or whispering about freedom. There were rumors flying through the quarters, whispered in the dark, passed from field to field. Lincoln had freed the slaves up north. The Union was winning. Freedom was coming. But when? And at what cost? Would the white folks let them go peacefully, or would there be more blood, more death, more suffering before the end? James was assigned to work in the gin house, the building where cotton was processed after picking. It was considered lighter work than field labor, suitable for children and the elderly. The gin house was a large wooden structure that smelled of cotton lint and machine oil and sweat and desperation. The gin itself was a massive contraption of wood and metal, powered by a mule walking in endless circles to turn the main shaft. The mule, a gray animal named Caesar, walked the same circular path 12 hours a day, every day, until he was too old and sick to continue. And then he was replaced by another mule who would walk the same path until he too broke down. Cotton went in one end of the gin, fluffy and full of seeds and bits of leaf and stem. It came out the other end cleaned, compressed, ready for market. The gin could process about 500 pounds per day when it was working well, which was not often. It jammed constantly. Parts broke, belts slipped, and when it stopped working, people were beaten because the white folks assumed someone had been careless or lazy. James' job was to feed cotton into the machine, keep the flow steady, and clear jams when they happened. It was dangerous work. The rotating drums could catch your hand if you were not careful, pull you in, crush your fingers or your whole arm. Every year, someone on some plantation lost a hand to a gin. But James was careful, and more than careful, he was fascinated. It was in the gin house that his education truly began. He watched that machine with an intensity that made the overseer nervous. "Boy, stop staring and keep working," Pettigrew would bark, his voice sharp with suspicion. But James could not help himself. He saw how the rotating drums with metal teeth grabbed the cotton and pulled it through narrow slots that were too small for the seeds to pass through. He saw how the lint was then brushed away by another set of drums rotating in the opposite direction. He saw how the cleaned cotton fell into a press where it was compressed into bales by a screw mechanism that required 2 strong men to operate. Every part of the machine had a purpose. Every movement was connected to every other movement. It was beautiful in a way he had no words to describe. Beautiful the way a river is beautiful, powerful and purposeful and inevitable. During his lunch break, which was 30 minutes at noon when the heat was most oppressive, James would walk around the gin house examining the other equipment. There were spare parts stacked in corners covered with dust and cobwebs. Old gears and pulleys hanging on walls like strange decorations. A broken conveyor belt coiled like a dead snake in one corner. Barrels of oil and grease. Piles of cotton that had been rejected for various defects. And in the back, Behind stacks of cotton bales that reached almost to the ceiling, there was a pile of scrap that had been accumulating for years. Please subscribe the channel.